Well, thank you for being here, for listening to this conversation about re-engineering globalization. The world is changing. What was cheap is now expensive. Food, energy, the price of money have all gone up relative to that first era of globalization that most of us have lived through since the early 90s. And with that has come an overturning of a lot of the assumptions that that era was based on. Maybe it's not deglobalization. Maybe it's not even decoupling, though we will probably talk about that. But it's certainly a rethink, a reorientation of the global economy, which is going to produce winners and losers. So I want to talk about all of that today with our two distinguished ministers. Your Excellency, Minister, in this new world, do all roads lead to the Gulf? Do all roads lead to the Gulf?
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be here. Let me greet and thank our hosts, State of Qatar, and congratulate them on great achievements that have been taking place here. Over many decades, really, I've been a friend of Qatar. I've been visiting Qatar, and every time you come, you see an amazing new development. Last year, of course, was the apex of that when Qatar set a new standard, which I think leads to answering your question, on hosting a global event of the scale of the World Cup. And it was not only the infrastructure, the facilities, but also the quality with which it was organized. And we're seeing it again today with convening global leaders here and government policy and business to talk about issues as important as energy, which we heard earlier, and now on globalization and global supply chain. Indeed, as you said, Stephanie, the world is very turbulent, and we've seen serious fissures in the global world order that we've known over many decades, concerning to many of us. Part of it is geopolitical security, as we see the war in Europe, and of course, global supply chains, which have been disrupted with serious challenges to flows of trade, flows of investment, flows of capital, and I worry that more to come with nationalism, protectionism, and some restrictions to trade, and walking away from a system that has been good to the global community. As you go to Riyadh, as you go to Qatar, as you go, we heard about Rwanda today, developing countries have benefited immensely from the global order that has been created over the last 3-4 decades, brought billions of people out of poverty into the middle class. I like to think that this region, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and our GCC colleagues, Iraq, who were here earlier, have contributed to this global well-being and this development through supply of energy over many decades. Going back to your question, when you look at the world today, where is a region that looks bright in the midst of this turbulence? Political stability, economic stability, currency stability, energy stability in terms of availability, not only of fossil fuels, but increasingly renewables, setting the stage, as His Royal Highness said, Prince Abdulaziz, with available of abundance of new energies of the future to fuel regions that are in dire need for energy supply. So indeed, the region is growing faster than the global average by a significant margin. There is a significant creation of capital in the region. Saudi Arabia last year registered 31% growth in capital formation in the economy of Saudi Arabia. Our GDP growth was significantly higher than the average G20. We were the fastest growing in the G20, but I think significantly the non-oil economy in Saudi Arabia grew by 5.5%. So far this year, despite declining oil prices and declining production, our non-oil GDP is growing at the same pace. So we're seeing a decoupling between the oil economy of Saudi Arabia and the non-oil economy of Saudi Arabia. And I'm sure it is replicated here in the GCC, which together constitute a significant market and a significant stabilizer for the global economy.
Just one follow-up to you, Excellency, if I may. You have said you wanted Riyadh to be the economic and political capital of the Middle East. I think for many outside the region, big businesses looking at the region, they would not obviously now point to Riyadh, and they would see a lot of competition for that crown, particularly Dubai, which has built up such a network of global companies. So how do you confront that, people that you're not the first choice or maybe even the second choice for inward investment?
Well, I think the fact that I want, Saudi Arabia is obviously the political capital of the Middle East. We are the convener of leaders from the region and abroad. We saw it during the visits of President Trump, President Biden, President Xi Jinping a few months ago, just convened one of the most successful Arab summits in history, resolving many issues within the Arab world, including a ceasefire in Sudan. Within the GCC, we see ourselves as a common market. You've set the stage, I think, for the world to see in Europe with the common market in the EU evolving over time. And within the EU, there is a healthy competition between capitals. When I was in the private sector, different capitals, different states within the EU were vying for our investment and our trade and our relationship. So I think if there is competition between certain capitals within the GCC, I think it's for the good of all of the GCC. And indeed, it contributes to the good of the world. But the combination of size, vision, and quality does matter. And Riyadh has all of the above plus a lot more. We have a vision that is into the decades, not a short-term vision, not a mid-term vision. We have economies of scale in a city that is approaching 8 million and growing at the fastest city. 50% of the Saudi GDP alone, which is about 50% of the GCC economy, with a huge developmental plan. Quality of life is transforming in Saudi Arabia in general, and in Riyadh in particular, at a pace we've never seen in our lives. So that trajectory is going to be good for the entire region. I think Qatar, Dubai, Kuwait, Bahrain, when I talk to leaders there, political leaders, business leaders, citizens, they're excited about the transformation, Vision 2030, what is happening in Saudi Arabia and what we're doing across the country for the Arab region as a whole, but specifically, I think it's going to be very beneficial for the integrated GCC economies.
Secretary of State, the UK is clearly in a different position. I guess, I mean, you and I are both from the UK. I think many on the outside, if they think of the Gulf and Asia as the future, it's very easy and is common to look at the UK as the past and a country that is pushing itself perhaps further behind from the decision to leave the EU. How do you confront that view?
And just before I answer the question, Stephanie, I think I must first of all thank the Qatar Economic Forum and all of the people who have hosted me on my first visit to Qatar. You're talking about the UK in a sense of us being the past. That's absolutely not the way we see it. We have had a long-standing cooperation with the countries of the GCC. I'm sure His Excellency would agree with me. And I just wanted to thank everyone for the very warm welcome which I've had on my first visit to the region. There's so much that I'm seeing and that I'm learning And I'm very privileged to be here and also just post the World Cup, thanking you for hosting such a fantastic event. You've turned my son into a football fan. He was 6 years old, didn't know any football, and now that's all that he's obsessed about. So I think that's a testament to the influence that this country and this region is having all across the world. But that doesn't mean that other countries are the past. We are evolving. The world is changing, and I think it would have been wrong for anyone to assume that the way the world was in 1880 or 1980 is the same way it's going to look for the future. What we're doing in the UK is making sure that we're able to adapt to the changing circumstances. And that's why we had our integrated review. We have a strategy to tilt towards the Indo-Pacific and the Gulf, the rest of the world, not just the EU. We still have a very strong relationship with the EU. You and I were talking earlier about the free trade agreement that we have there. But we are a trading nation, and we want to trade with the rest of the world. That's why I'm here, making sure that we successfully negotiate our GCC free trade agreement, but also making sure that people can see that the UK is open for business. We're still one of the top investment destinations. People see us as a stable place. We have an environment where the rule of law applies. People know where they stand. We have really wonderful skills. We're placed in the perfect place in terms of time zones. And we're welcoming to the world. The very fact that I'm sitting here, people will know that my ancestry is not British, and yet I'm sitting here as a Secretary of State. It shows that it's a place where people can come to and achieve whatever it is that they can fulfill their potential. And I think that's the story about the UK that we want to tell to the rest of the world.
But if, going back to how I started this session, if you look at the tectonic shifts going on in the global economy, one of them is in favor of regionalism in trade over globalism. Another is the rise of renewables, and looking to a future for renewables and indeed electric car production. In many of these areas, the feeling is the UK is now going to be caught between the US and the EU. The former Bank of England chief economist has talked of a global arms race to reindustrialize, which we're at risk of falling behind in. How do you confront those realities? We can never put the same kind of money into this as the US or the EU.
Well, everyone is at risk. So I think one of the things we mustn't do is create a story around UK exceptionalism. The EU is not a country. The US is. The countries within the EU are all concerned about what is going on in terms of the response to the US's Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, as we refer to it in the UK. They don't necessarily know whether they will benefit even if the EU has its own program, because it's about member countries. So I have spoken to my counterparts in other EU countries, and they worry, will France get all the benefits? Will it be Germany? And even within the US, there's a lot of intrastate competition. So the story about the EU doing one thing and the US doing another, and the UK being caught in the middle, I think is first of all, overly simplistic and not quite true. There is a lot that is going on around the world. You look at some of the things that are happening at the WTO with the dispute settlement mechanism issue, the appellate body. Everybody is worried about fragmentation. This is not something that specifically applies to the UK. What we can do is have our own response that is specific to our economy. No, we can't spend 400 or 500 billion like the US does, but we shouldn't have to. We don't have the same population. We don't have the same needs. What we need to do is look at what we do best. Where is our comparative advantage? What should we be investing in? And that is where the work that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have done in terms of identifying those 5 sectors where we want to specialize in. We don't call it an industrial strategy, but if you look at the announcements we've made, where we've put the money, which industries we have been supporting when they've run into trouble, I think it's quite clear the picture that we are painting about what the UK is about.
Your Excellency, one of the things that we will talk about is de-risking, and for some that is a byword for decoupling from China. But I see that there is an Arab-China business forum next month. How do you see Saudi's relationship with Chinese business and how going forward? And where does that fit in with other countries trying to move away from China?
Well, for us in the region, and certainly for us in Saudi Arabia, and I can speak for the kingdom, we don't see our relationship with China any differently than we've seen our relationship with Japan, Korea, and the rest of developing Asia over the last few decades, as I mentioned, as this shift in the global economy happens and evolves over time as billions of people come out of poverty and create centers of demand and increasingly centers of production, centers of innovation, and centers of capital and finance. And again, China is a continuation of a trend that started in the 1950s and 60s, and the region has been adapting to it appropriately, providing energy to developing Asia, and in turn importing a lot of our manufactured developed goods. So China today, our trade with China is equivalent to the total trade with the US and the EU. They are by far the largest importer from the kingdom, not only oil and LPG and other oil petroleum products, but manufactured goods, including chemicals, rubbers, plastics, and elastomers. So we are tied with China in many ways. We're a big investor in China. China is increasingly looking at the kingdom as an investment platform as it evolves in its own development plan. In the meantime, we're committed to our relationship with Western countries. The US remains to be our biggest partner in terms of capital flows. We're a big investor in the US, and we'll continue to do that. And we import also a lot of highly advanced, and we believe the US will continue to lead in innovation, technology development, and the financial markets in the US will continue to be dominant. So there is no decoupling in any sense between Saudi Arabia, but we play where our interests are without in any way compromising on our principles and values. And that has served us well over the years, following our interest and creating relationships that are not tactical, not short-term, but long-term strategic. And that is the case with our partners from the US, Europe, UK, of course, as the Secretary of State said in her opening remarks, and with Asian countries, including China.
And Secretary of State, we have, over the years, recently, Britain has been a bit more wary of Chinese inward investment in certain key industries and technologies. Mm-hmm. I think it would be useful to know where we currently stand on that. Where are we comfortable having Chinese inward investment, and where do we think we now have to be more concerned and more careful?
I think our strategy is not entirely about China. The relationship that we have with China is a pragmatic one. As with every other country in the world, we work well where we can, but also quite often we are in competition. The world that came out of the pandemic was one where we saw that economic resilience, economic security, you look at things like supply chains, they suddenly became more of a concern generally, just because of what happened when there was an over-reliance on one country. It is very risky for everybody to be reliant on one country. China is obviously, it's the biggest exporter in the world. We all have relationships with it, but we mustn't be in a situation where if something goes wrong with China or in China, as we saw during the pandemic, that the whole world grinds to a halt. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of how we are deciding where to protect and where economic security is more of an issue. But what I will say is that we want to have a good investment relationship with countries like China, but that's not going to be at the expense of our economic security.
Just to follow up a bit, because when you were talking earlier, you said, you know, Britain doesn't have to do everything. We pick our comparative advantage, which feels to me as an economist as the way we used to think about globalization. But the way that you've just talked about it is more the way we talk about it now, that you don't want to be reliant on the one country that has got the comparative advantage. You actually have to make the stuff yourself. So that's why you won't...
No, actually, there's quite a lot in between those two positions. So diversification, diversifying where you get resources from. Some people will use phrases like friendshoring or nearshoring, however you want to describe it. You may call some of that a little bit more regionalism. But everybody needs to make sure that they're able to look after the people in their country and do their best in that. That's why we are doing the jobs that we're doing. It's not about trying to stick to a particular economic theory. It is looking at the world situation, what is working, what isn't. And what we saw was that the breakdown in supply chains meant that we were too reliant on one particular way. So let's diversify. And it also means helping other countries that are in difficulty grow, do well. That means having more economic partnerships, whether it's more free trade agreements, more ways of cooperating, because a world that has economic growth globally is one that is good for the UK. We don't believe in a zero-sum game. If everybody else around us is getting poorer, we will get poorer. If everyone else around us is getting richer, we know that we will get richer, and that's really what we're working towards.
Excellency, you've launched your supply chain resilience initiative. You know, this is a very important area for many countries, looking at their vulnerabilities. How are you envisaging? Are you bringing companies in to improve resilience? How are you thinking about making supply chains more resilient?
So just following on what the Secretary of State said, diversification globally is very important. And also coupling this with net zero commitments that almost every country has declared. So we need to lighten the carbon and the greenhouse gas emission footprint of global supply chain, global manufacturing, and introduce cleaner and greener fuels over the next couple of 2 or 3 decades. And we believe the Kingdom ticks all the boxes when it comes to meeting the criteria that Her Excellency talked to. Location is close to many of the demand centers, existing demand centers and emerging demand centers in Africa and Europe. Stability of the economy, multiple ports for exports, both in the Arabian Gulf and the Red Sea, pegged currency. As I mentioned, energy will constitute renewables will constitute 50% of our electrification. We're introducing already 3 OEMs that will be making electric vehicles in the Kingdom, mostly for exports, not just for our own consumption. Accessing materials within the Kingdom where we have significant mineral resources, but also closeness to Africa, closeness to mineral resources in Asia, bringing it to the Kingdom where we can do value add, and then maybe as intermediate products, advanced materials that can go into final assemblies into the UK, into Europe, into the US, into developed countries in Asia. That's what our program that you mentioned, GISRI, the Global Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, is all about. Of course, it's coupled with our investment capability. The Kingdom is an investment powerhouse, as mentioned in our Vision 2030. So we have Saudi companies that can invest on their own or co-invest. We're one of the biggest fertilizer, petrochemical, aluminum manufacturers already. Of course, we're known for oil and gas already. So, but we will joint venture. We will work together with international investors. We'll bring in international capital. We've announced multiple special economic zones that will give all of the regulatory needs for international, multinational companies to choose the Kingdom as a platform.
Just specifically on that, I just wondered, do you expect that most of the big deals will be co-anchored by a state entity, like Aramco or PIF, as we've seen with some other deals?
That happens to be the pattern now, but it's not a precondition. I think international companies prefer a strong local investor of the highest reputation, and we have many.
Would you prefer not? Would you prefer to have them come without that?
We are, as a Minister of Investment, we treat investors the same, but we allow them to joint venture when they want to, when it's good for both of them. But the state and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with very, very few exceptions, hardly none, leaves it open for international investors to come and choose the Kingdom as their home and operate unhindered by any regulatory constraints. And certainly there is no requirement that they have a local partner unless they find it to be value-adding and beneficial to them.
And Secretary of State, I'll leave the last word with you. I mean, when you think of the sectors that you want to prioritize, the car industry in the UK has been our biggest export for some time, but the car exporting and production has fallen dramatically since the Brexit referendum for a lot of reasons. How will you ensure the future of the UK car industry? Because I think people look at that as a sign for many other sectors as well.
I think that's absolutely right, and it's an excellent question, because what I've been talking about, comparative advantage, making sure that we look after supply chains, really impacts the car industry, probably more than most. What I would say to all the people who work in that industry and to that sector generally is that we are doing everything we can to look after you. We want people to continue to invest in the UK. We think that we have a lot of strength there. So I'm working on a plan, an advanced manufacturing plan, so to speak, which should be a way of helping to corral a little bit more in terms of not just support, but more streamlined policy about what we're going to do in order to make sure that this industry survives. It's critical for our transition to net zero. It's also critical to the UK government's levelling up agenda. It's very, very important for things like R&D, science. People often just think of the car industry as a manufacturing one, but actually there's a lot of research and development that is being done that is really essential for our productivity, for our economic growth. So we're working on it. We are also looking at what else is going on in the world, but I think that when we do come out with our plan, the sector will be very pleased.
And is that going to be before the autumn, or is it waiting on the Chancellor's tax subsidies, or what?
All I will say, Stephanie, is wait and see.
And how much is the deal with is a negotiation with the EU part of that plan, or crucial to that plan?
It's not reliant. It's not reliant on it. We are still part of a global economy. Obviously, what the EU does and our free trade agreement with them is going to be absolutely essential. And I am in discussions with them on issues like rules of origin, which, to be honest, they're quite acute now. They're not specifically to do with that agreement, but actually to do with rising costs for production and for components.
Excellency, Secretary of State, we've run out of time, but we'll be talking about many of these issues over the next 2 days. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.